And we do pray for the families and just everybody today. We're excited to hear of good things from Grant and Kaylee in the months and years to come. This morning I invite you to turn to 1 Corinthians 13. And as you're turning there, you may think to yourself, I've heard this passage before. Is he going to read this passage? This is the love passage. Doesn't this belong in weddings? Isn't this out of place on the Sunday after Christmas? I invite you, as 1 Corinthians 13 is read this morning, to hear it with fresh ears, as if it's the first time you have ever heard this passage. 1 Corinthians 13, beginning in verse 1. If I speak in human or angelic tongues, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all that I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast. It is not proud, it does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection in a mirror, then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, and then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. There was a sermon given by Martin Luther, the great reformer, in 1543 on Christmas Day. This is what Martin Luther said. The inn was full. There are many of you who think to yourselves, if only I had been there, if only I had been there, how quick I would have been to help the baby. And then he goes on to say, why don't you do it now? Why don't you do it now? You have Christ in your neighbor. You ought to serve your neighbor, for what you do to your neighbor in need, you do to the Lord Christ himself. So today we consider again the work of Christmas that is before us. We remember that the very first visitors at the manger, the shepherds, they resolved to spread the good news that they had heard. They heard from the heavenly messengers that first shared this world-altering news to outcasts on the outskirts of town. Do not be afraid, the angel said, for I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all of the people. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you, and he is Messiah the Lord. That was the message of the angels to the shepherds. So we should not overlook this significance of shepherds being the first audience to this heavenly flash mob. In this day of social media and internet, news can get out so quick. And so I've heard over recent years from parents who were getting ready to announce the birth of their child, that many parents choose to share the news first with their close family and friends before they go and share it on social media. It's not that people are unimportant and that everybody on their social media feeds are unimportant, but it should be considered an honor if you are let in on some joyful news like the birth of a child, that they say, listen, we're not going to put this out on social media yet, but you are important enough for us to tell you that so-and-so was born, and this, the stats and all of those wonderful things that parents share about their children when they are born. God's bringers of good news, that heavenly messenger crowd, they could have spread the message of Christ's birth all over the globe and all at once in a way that would have caused our modern communications to look primitive. The heavenly messengers could have shared the news like that all over the world to everybody and anybody that was alive. But instead, for this most significant event in history, it happens and it's announced in the most insignificant and small way. The human bearers of this news, the shepherds, they were the first evangelists. And they were probably ones that as they were sharing the news that they had heard about Jesus and the sight of this babe lying in swaddling clothes in the manger, they probably wouldn't have been believed. Their reputation was such that their credibility would have been questioned. But we know that the shepherds did their job. They shared that joyful news. They took serious the work of Christmas, and we today are recipients. We are the ripple effects of the message of those shepherds who went, they told it on the mountain, and everywhere they went. That's the song that we sang today. Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills, and everywhere. Share the message of joy. My friends, there is none too insignificant. There are none who are unqualified to be bearers and sharers of this good news of Jesus Christ. I remember as a kid growing up in a church that we had a working bell in the bell tower. A lot of churches have a bell tower but no bell, or maybe if they're afraid that if you pull on the rope that the bell may come crashing down, but we had a church where it was an active bell, it was a working bell, and every Sunday the kids were invited to come and to ring the bell at the start of service. Now it took a little bit of effort to pull the rope up and down, but once the rope got to go, and once the bell got to swinging in the bell tower, it was all you could do if there was one or two or even three kids on the rope. If there was not an adult who was paying attention, that rope would be pulling kids up, kind of holding on for dear life, their feet's kind of leaving the ground. And it was just great joy. We would see how hard we can pull the rope to kind of see how high we can get each other up off the ground. There would be laughter, and as one kid got off the rope, another one would try and get onto there and start to swing and to go for the ride themselves, until one of the parents came along, and one of the killjoys, and said, you've rung the bell enough, you can ring it next Sunday. Now, for centuries, the ringing of bells before church service, was the call to worship, the sound of the bells coming from the belfries. It was the alarm clock for all to hear. For all that heard, if you were sleeping in and you heard the church bells going off, you knew that you were missing service. It was a reminder, and it was an invitation for everyone to come and find your way to the sanctuary. It was a call to prayer. You could think of it as possibly the dinner bell, saying the table is set. Eucharist is ready for the faithful to come and worship Christ. Pastor Brian Zond here in town at Word of Life Church, he talks about being in Jerusalem and hearing all of the bells on Christmas morning ring all throughout the city. He says that the bells from Orthodox and Catholic, Armenian, Anglican, and Lutheran churches, he said they were all going off at the same time. Then he talks about the mighty, deep bass bells from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He calls it a holy cacophony of sacred bells and says it was wonderful, if you can imagine that many bells from all these different traditions and churches going off at the same time. Brian Zahn goes on to say that it was strangely and deeply moving. The church bell is the sound of the Christian faith. There are some sounds that sound very welcoming. When the bells came ringing into the sanctuary this morning, and they got closer to the front, and it started to fill the sanctuary, it made me think of all of these different bells going off from different churches. It was beautiful. It was pleasant to hear. But there are some sounds that are a turnoff. You probably have your list of what sounds are a turnoff to you. They're harsh. They make us cringe. They don't inspire joy. Of course, probably number one is probably fingernails on the chalkboard. Doesn't sound too good. Snoring. Does anyone have, I want to ask that. Snoring. For me, a big one is chewing with your mouth open, kind of smacking with food, just being really loud with your food. Gilbert Gottfried's voice I find particularly annoying. I don't like listening to that. And the Rock Chalk Jayhawk chant. I don't... See. A little more dangerous to say that here than in other places that I've been at. Paul the Apostle talks about irritating sounds, irritating noises in 1 Corinthians 13. As he starts off from verse 1, if I speak in the tongues of men or angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. You can only take so much of a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Someone who doesn't know how to play the drums and gets up onto a drum set. I don't know if there's been any parents that you've bought like a drum set for your kids on Christmas Day and then immediately regretted that. You need to have like an Allen, right? You need to have an Allen who can play skillfully and as a complement to the other instruments, providing that crucial beat and that rhythm. Some people, and I've been a person who thought that being a sharer of the good news of Jesus meant being the loudest, most obnoxious person in the room. I heard this quote, or I read this quote on Facebook not too long ago. It says, sometimes the best evangelism is simply telling people you are a Christian and then not being a jerk. Sometimes the best evangelism is simply telling people you're a Christian than not being a jerk. I grew up in a Christian environment that talked a lot about sharing good news, but oftentimes it amounted to nothing more than fear-mongering. It didn't amount to more than a cult-like suspicion of anyone who was on the outside, anyone who was different than us. And it was even other Christians who met in other church buildings around the city. We were the ones who had it right. Why weren't they worshiping with us? That was sort of the Christian culture that I grew up in. There was very little joy, a lot of doom and gloom prognostications. And so Paul says to the Corinthians in his letter this morning, he says, you can be the smartest person in the room. You can be the most spiritual person in the room, and you can even be the most courageous person, offering your body over to dying in a fire. But if it's not accompanied in love, then we are nothing, and we gain nothing. That's Paul's message. That we can say what we believe so loudly and until we're blue in the face, but if we are not motivated by joy, and if we do not model love through it all, then it doesn't matter how good we think we sound or how convinced we are of how right we are. Our sharing of good news ought to resemble the ringing of a bell more than a clanging of a cymbal. That's the challenge for us in sharing the good news. How do we sound to the world around us? Are we a pealing bell or a clanging cymbal? The pealing of church bells is the sound of gathering. It's the sound of an open invitation, the sound of melody and harmony coming together. It's the sound of come all of you, come as you are. It's that sound of come, rise and shine, for a new day has begun. It's the sound that goes before a joyous proclamation, or perhaps you've been to a wedding that as the bride and the groom are leaving the church, the bells are sounding. It's the start of a new day, the start of a feast. This morning we sang this song called "I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day," and it's become one of my favorites over the last few years, mainly because I heard the story, the history behind the writing of this hymn. It was written by a gentleman, a poet named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in the winter of 1863. Of course, we know during that time the Civil War was going on. Sons and fathers and brothers from Mississippi to Maine did not come home for Christmas that year, and many would not return at all. Henry himself was a poet who lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he was pondering the state of the world around him because over the couple of years leading up to him writing this hymn, he had been through some really tough times, some tragic times. His wife's dress had caught on fire. And as he was trying to save her and put out the flames, he jumped on her and was burned himself very badly. In the process, his wife was killed from that tragic accident. And then about a year or two later, after losing his wife to that fire, his son Charles was fighting for the North in the Battle of New Hope Church, December 1st of 1863, and his son Charles was wounded, and he was at the home with his father Henry on Christmas Day of 1863, and Henry was thinking about all of the stuff that's going on in life. He was struggling with kind of how so much hatred could exist in human hearts, how tragedy could be such a thing in our world. And as he's kind of thinking on Christmas Day of all of the things that are not going right in the world, he begins to hear the church bells go off. Various church bells around town. And he couldn't make sense of this joyous noise of church bells, but yet violence and hatred and war and all sorts of other things. And so Henry, as he's trying to make sense of church bells ringing in war and death, he takes up his pen and he writes this haunting poem that we sung this morning. I heard the bells on Christmas Day. Their old familiar carols play. We know them. We've heard this story before. Wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And thought how, as the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had rolled along the unbroken song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Listen to verse 3. And in despair, I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said. For hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Verse 4. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead and does not sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail with peace on earth, goodwill to men. The sound of the bells that Henry heard on Christmas Day were ringing in defiance of the pervasive hatred and fear and despair and brokenness of the world around him. What would have been wrong would be for the bells to stop ringing in the midst of tragedy and in the midst of hate. Those bells ring in defiance. And so, my friends, the work of Christmas is the antidote to what ails this world as we look around and we see all sorts of things that trouble our hearts. And it's easy, it would be easy for us to be like Henry and to bow our heads in despair and say, there is no peace on earth. Perhaps wonder if God is still alive. But Henry concludes that we need to ring those bells more loud and deep, for God is not dead, and God does not sleep. And peace on earth comes through you and I doing faithfully the work of Christmas. Let me read this poem in closing by Howard Thurman as he titles this, The Work of Christmas. This is what is before you and I. If we are going to be bells ringing instead of clanging cymbals or resounding gongs, this is what the work of Christmas is. When the song of angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when kings and princes are home, when shepherds are back with their flock, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, to bring peace among people, to make music in the heart. This, my friends, is the work of Christmas. And so I pray that as we go about and we begin at some point to take down our decorations and the spirit of the season kind of wanes and the cold January weather comes in, my friends, that we would just now begin to do the work, that we would be like the shepherds, and that our lives would be joyful, that our lives would be a melodious sound to the world around us. Bells, no clanging cymbals, no resounding gongs, the bells of a life lived out in service to Christ. That's our work, you and me together. May it be so. Let us go and tell it on the mountain, over the hills, and everywhere. Would you pray with me?